All right, I got Trevor Connor and Dr. Mark Smith on the show. Trevor is the CEO of the Paleo Diet and the co-author of the upcoming book, Paleo for Life, Superfoods to Slow Aging, Boost Longevity, and Enhance Your Well-Being. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us. We've been excited.
Thanks. Yeah, glad to be here.
Yeah, well, excited to have you guys on. I remember reading the first paleo book back in the day with Dr. Lauren Cordain, and then I remember Rob Wolf, I think, got kind of tied in with her and her world and that world. And there's all the paleo rage. I mean, this is when I got started with health. This is going back 10 years ago, and then CrossFit. I think there's a huge surge, and they were pushing paleo, and that was like the way to eat. I think for a lot of us, at least for me, that was at the time like I felt like I had always been into the health and wellness scene, but this is really which it shaped the way I had eaten, right? And I think for a lot of people, there's like this made sense. Like this is how paleo is, like this is our ancestors, this is how we were supposed to eat in a sense. And now I feel like paleo has been out of the limelight. We've seen a lot with keto and carnivore, but I'm curious for you guys, like what's new or what's new and exciting with paleo that that you guys, what I really feel like is coming with this book is you're leaving off where Dr. Lauren left off. So what's new and exciting?
Mark, you want to jump on this?
Yeah, I think that one of the first things that sort of was the impetus for the book was Dr. Cordain got into the fermentation. He actually wrote an article for the website when he was talking about menaquinones and how potent of vitamin K2 and how potent of an antioxidant they were. And he said, guess where the highest concentration of menaquinones are? And it was in St. Louis style pork ribs and dark chocolate. And sort of he tied in some of the longevity stories of Clement in France living to 126, and she ate like 2 kilos or 2 pounds of dark chocolate a week, things like that. So, but a lot of that mechanism, and that spurred a lot of his interest in going deeper and into with those menaquinones being just one, what we would call longevity vitamins and proteins, as opposed to survival, which is kind of the idea. If you don't have this, you're going to get sick. But we're talking about going a stage further for longevity.
Yeah. I love that you brought up the kind of the age of this, because these are the things that age you. Yeah, I still, up to a couple of years ago, was telling people about this whole new concept of the paleo diet that we had. And then we published an article about the 20th anniversary. And I was like, has it been that long? Seriously?
Yeah. Wow.
Well, yeah, no, a lot has happened. And as Mark said, Dr. Cordain, he's a researcher through and through. And he just kept reading the research. That's how he came up with the original book, and kind of hit Mark and I a few years back with, have you seen this? Have you seen that? All this new stuff that's coming out. And he got really excited and said, we got to put this into a book.
So are we saying that red meat and dark chocolate, are these the longevity superfoods now?
Yeah. Have you seen the movie The Sleeper?
No.
I sent the video clip to, so this is a Woody Allen movie where he gets cryogenically frozen and he wakes up in the future and he's asking for like all these, what were considered the healthy foods in the 70s. And the scientists are like, can you believe he still finds that stuff healthy? It's like, now we know it's red meat and chocolate.
Yeah.
And I sent that to Dr. Cordain. I'm like, you're making this movie real.
But, those are certainly discussed in the book. So we go into, I think one of the takes of the book, and one of the things that we've really tried to do is it's the work of Bruce Ames. He had a paper particularly relevant where he was talking about this concept of vitamins and proteins for survival, but for longevity, often, those they're used for both. So you need more than you think. It's not an RDA. But then there are others that actually aren't involved necessarily in survival, but they're there for longevity. So it was digging deeper into that research of looking at these longevity vitamins and proteins, and then what foods provide these nutrients.
If you haven't heard of Dr. Ames, I believe he's at Harvard. He's still a full professor. He's still publishing, and he's 95 years old.
Wow.
But he had a really good point that we were able to identify all of these survival vitamins and minerals because it was easy. If you were deficient in one, you knew about it pretty quickly and you knew the effects. His point was there's significantly more nutrients that we need for healthy longevity, but they're not as easy to identify because you're deficient. It's going to take decades to find out the effects. And we're only just now starting to identify what some of these are.
Gotcha. In terms of paleo, has much changed though in terms of I think the general principles when we were looking at nuts and healthy organs and fats, you know, and I know like essentially like gluten and a lot of like the ferment like bread like that was pretty much back then it was no, don't eat that, stay away from that. And gluten and dairy, I think even from a holistic health perspective, they're probably like the top two allergens we see on food sensitivity tests. But is that still kind of the general rule, or has anything changed that, back in the research back then?
I would say most of it is the same. A lot of this is confirmation of why so many of these foods are really healthy for you. Really digging into some of these foods that are just foundational to the paleo diet and looking at the nutrients in them and saying those are some of the key longevity vitamins. That's why you need to be eating a lot of these foods. As Mark said, I think or basically Dr. Cordain said to us, here's the thing that I missed, and it was the fermentation. If you go back 20,000 years ago, they didn't have refrigeration. The hunt wasn't always successful every single day. They weren't always eating fresh food. They would be eating some food that I hate to say was starting to rot a little bit. So there would be some fermentation in. And it would just be a natural part of their diet. And one of the biggest things we see is these menaquinones, which is a very powerful antioxidant that Mark was talking about, can only be produced through fermentation.
The good thing is we're not advocating for eating rotten
Yes.
foods, but the nutrients that came from that we can obtain. Dark chocolate because of the fermentation of the cacao bean. In the case of the pork, St. Louis pork style ribs, the fermentation that goes through a lot of the food that they do eat. But I from a perspective, I mean, if we want to talk longevity, I was Dr. Cordain's first graduate student ever interested in paleo. So we're talking 1988 when I came from England to Colorado State University. And like you said, Joel, it just made sense. These are the foods you're supposed to eat. And I've probably been working with people, helping coach them into eating this way longer than anyone. And probably, as lots and lots of people doing it. So it might be interesting to see how I take a difference back then to today. And we address this in the book. One of the things, people will argue it's a bit like religion with diet, isn't it? But if I say to someone, okay, would you agree that a diet should be metabolically healthy so it doesn't cause elevated blood sugar levels, bad lipid profiles, cause you to gain weight? Everyone's going to go, yeah, of course. Okay. Would you also agree that a diet should be very nutrient dense, have a lot of nutrients that we're now talking about, that both for survival and longevity? Yes, of course. You're right. And then the other thing that's become obviously more prevalent now is, and would you say it's good to have a diet low in anti-nutrients or completely devoid of anti-nutrients? And everyone's going to agree. So then it's like, okay, well, what diet best fits that? So I would say, in general, the paleo diet best fits that, but with now, I think, a lot more nuanced individuality. And that's where we can sort of discuss a lot. And I think particularly on the anti-nutrient side of things, I think there's a huge genetic factor there of some people tolerating anti-nutrients and others not.
Yeah, awesome. Can you kind of riff on that anti-nutrient? Because, immediately what I thought of was like, gluten or some of these oxalates or, some of these lectins maybe. But what were you guys thinking of in terms of the what are like some of the big anti-nutrients that maybe people are eating a pretty clean diet? I think I have a pretty clean lifestyle, but I'll be honest, guys, I don't really prescribe to, I've gone and done everything. I've done paleo, I've done keto, I've done carnivore, I've done it all. I love them all, but I don't really eat a specific way nowadays. I just kind of eat intuitively. But yeah, what are some of the anti-nutrients that, affect people the most, you think?
Yeah, and look, I talk with people all the time that have that approach, and my philosophy whenever I talk to people is I don't care if you ever use the term paleo or not. What we're trying to drive people to is a healthier diet, and I always find that the simplest principles are the best. You're eating nutrient dense, less processed foods than you were before. You're heading towards a healthier diet, and we can dive into the science of specific things like the anti nutrients. that was actually the focus of my thesis with Dr. Cordain, was looking at the impact of grains, particularly wheat, on autoimmune disease. And it was actually extraordinary doing that research. Absolutely fascinating. I actually ended up doing an extra year with Dr. Cordain, just studying immunology so that we could write that paper. And there are multiple components that you see in a lot of grains, but particularly wheat, that are just highly effective at elevating your immune system. So I don't know how much you want to dive into the science, but what I was really looking at was the balance of what are called two particular T cells in your immune system, what's called T regulatory cells and Th17 cells. T regulatory cells keep your immune system down regulated, basically tell your immune system, don't respond, everything's good, let's just stay calm. Th17 cells are a highly inflammatory cell that's designed basically to deal with bacterial invasions, but they're going to do a lot of damage to your own body along the way. So you don't want them elevated for a very long period of time. And what we found in our research was some of the anti-nutrients that you find in wheat, such as gliadin, such as amylase trypsin inhibitors, such as WGA, are really, really effective at getting into your system and elevating Th17 and inappropriately elevating Th17 and keeping it upregulated. And what we found was every single autoimmune disease is preceded by chronically elevated Th17. So this is a
Wow.
really important mechanism in our body.
Yeah,
I
huge.
think going to the anti-nutrients is, when I'm talking to a layperson, I start with gluten because they've all heard of it. And I go, well, that's a lectin. It's basically a protein and a glycogen molecule. And the body doesn't digest it. And so it stays intact. And it can get into the systemic system through two ways. It can actually get in through a leaky gut if you've got an unhealthy gut. And it can also bind the epidermal growth factor receptor in the luminal side of your gut. So we can get into that, but there's different ways of it getting into your systemic system, but there's a genetic component to that. So I talk about gluten to them just to understand it, but I go, look, there are anti-nutrients, many, many different anti-nutrients, and they are primarily found in plants and vegetables more so than fruits, right? Fruits, the plant's trying to go, hey, eat this, walk away, poo it out. That's how they propagate. So, you'll see now on a lot of social media, this big sort of plants are full of anti-nutrients. And yes, they are, but many of these anti-nutrients are not going to be problematic for most people. But when clinically, if I have someone with gut issues, my kind of go-to place is animal protein and fruit and take out all vegetables. And I've had unbelievable success with that. But if we then talk about our longevity book, there are some very powerful vegetables that have these, so it's a matter of like, look, if it's not a problem for you, then consume them to get this good stuff. And obviously cooking can, spinach, for example, the oxalates, you'd reduce the oxalate concentration if you cook the spinach. So there's lots of ways. And I think that's where it then becomes very individualistic to go and try things for yourself. And that's the biggest change for me. But the general pattern for paleo is, as Trevor said, hasn't really changed. Why would it have changed? It was this way from day one, way back. And then when the research on it started as well. So.
Yeah. And so it's the biggest one, then it sounds like, is going to be gluten. Probably is the number one probably that you guys see is the anti-nutrient. Obviously there's more, go out and read the book, but that's probably the number one, huh?
There are other anti-nutrients. So Mark mentioned a lot of plant foods have what are called lectins in them. And lectins are really designed to evade the protective systems in your gut, get into your system, and activate your immune system. And if you eat a lot of them, that just makes you really sick. And then the idea is you don't eat that plant again because you remember it made you sick the last time. Some lectins are worse than others. And I would say gluten, that was what I was doing most of my research on. It is actually amazing its ability to take apart your digestive system and activate your immune system. So if there's one to eliminate, that would be the one. Particularly people are constantly complaining about being bloated, about having digestive issues, about feeling inflamed all the time, all these sort of issues that you see associated with chronic inflammation. Getting gluten out of your diet would be a great place to start and see how you respond.
So no more sourdough bread for me?
Sorry.
I thought the fermentation what's that?
Depends how you tolerate it. I'll also say this. There's a little anecdotal story, not a research story, but I was working when I first met Dr. Cordain in the early years. There was quite a prevalence of multiple sclerosis in Fort Collins. And I was sort of going out doing lectures on the concept. And at that time, it was a bit of a concept. You know, we were going, if we're not eating these, are we even going to be nutrient deficient? And we did the analysis and realized we actually improved the nutrient density of the most deficient 13 vitamins and minerals in the diet. So we knew that we were good with that, but it was still early days. Anyway, somehow I ended up working with a lady with multiple sclerosis, and we were talking about this is the approach we want to take. And we discovered, to try and do this quickly, we discovered that beans were very bad for her. So no beans, good, right? With multiple sclerosis, there was some research suggesting if you could get DHA levels up, the essential fatty acid DHA, that would be beneficial. So I just said, look, see if you can go to the local health food store, get some DHA. And so she did that, took a couple of pills, calls me up and was like, well, clearly I can't do DHA. I had a terrible reaction because we had got her to a point where she was doing really, really well. Her gait had improved. She could function throughout the day, whereas it used to be she'd put a load of laundry in and go back to bed. So she was a very, very compromised lady with her health. So she's doing very well, had this terrible reaction. I remember talking to Dr. Cordain. He's like, yeah, that fatty acid ratio could be important. I'm like, it can't be the ratio. A couple of pills, like that can't affect. I said, there's probably something in that pill. And I said, can you read what's on the pill? And it said that the gelatin capsule had been darkened with the herbal extract, carob. Well, carob is a bean extract. And we'd established beans were a no-no for her. So, tiny amount, obviously, in her body, but that was enough to be problematic. So the reason this spurned that my thought when you said no sourdough bread, she learned with her body to go to the movie theaters, and she said, I can have 3 pieces of popcorn. If I have 5, I'm in trouble.
Wow.
So I thought that was very interesting, where sometimes there is a quantity threshold, whereas other times, with that carob, it didn't appear to be. It was just the molecule of it was enough to trigger her immune system. So, but sometimes there's a quantity factor, I think. So
yeah,
you can probably tolerate one slice of sourdough. I'll give you that.
Okay, good. Phew. I wanted to ask you guys, because, when we jumped off with when we jumped into things, you said, well, actually the great thing about paleos is just over the last 20 years, this has been more confirmation that this is probably, the best way to eat and lifestyle of eating. What has been the biggest confirmation? Has there just been more studies that you guys have seen that's been confirming it, or anecdotally, or just for your own research through working with your patient population? Like, what has been the biggest mover for you guys that you've seen that's kind of confirmed that? Because as you know, in the dietary and the anti-aging and, longevity world that we live in, every day there's a new diet, whether it's the plant paradox, the blue zones, the keto diet, or the carnivore. They're all the best, right? So, and I do want to talk about some of these individually, but for you guys, like, what has been that confirmation? I was just kind of curious.
So we're kind of repeating what we said before, but I'll take it a little further. Reading the work of Dr. Ames was a huge confirmation for us. So again, he called it longevity vitamins, but he was really referring to all nutrients. I think he just wanted to use a simplified term. But what he really got at is there's 20 essential vitamins and minerals that are the survivals. But there's probably thousands of these longevity nutrients that we need. And for every one that we know the name of, there's probably 5 or 10 that we don't know the name of. And that to me was really confirming of the paleo diet, because something that is different about the paleo diet, most diets really focus on a macronutrient ratio. Is a healthy diet, high carb, low carb, high fat, low fat. And I will always make the argument, I can give you a healthy diet that's high carbohydrate and give you a healthy diet that's low carbohydrate. Same thing with fat. It's what are the foods that you are eating? What are the sources? And we've been saying time and time again, a diet should be about what are the foods you should eat and shouldn't eat. And what Dr. Ames' work was confirming, because basically what he's saying is, since we don't know so many of these longevity vitamins or nutrients, you need to be eating foods that we know are generally dense, are nutritionally dense. And you're probably, if you're eating those foods, going to get the nutrients that you need, both the ones that we have identified and the ones that we haven't. So that to me was really an argument of you can't supplement your way to health. You really need to eat a paleo diet that is a nutrient dense, more natural food diet.
I'd say as well, on the research side of things, things have changed. Obviously, when we first started, there was no research on Paleolithic nutrition
Good point.
as a diet in like a clinical trial. So all of the arguments were based on, all right, so our theory is you should be eating animal protein, vegetables, fruits, nuts, and seeds, no grains, no dairy, no legumes, no highly processed foods. So the research would be like, said, Dr. Cordain, when he started this, he had one filing cabinet on grains and the negative impact of grains on human health. But that doesn't necessarily support paleo. It doesn't, you know what I mean? So we had to build the argument showing that these foods that we're saying you shouldn't eat impact you negatively. But of course, since then, and since the movement became very popular, there are now many research studies on paleo, and particularly important are the meta-analysis. So when you ask about, is there anything recent? Yes, there is. I'll just pull it up here. Very recent in the 2022 in Nutrients. Liang was the lead author. Fiona O'Leary is out of Australia, most of this, but they did a meta-analysis and they compared basically the paleo diet, Mediterranean, the DASH diet, the Western diet, the plant food diet, and they looked at all of these and looked at different markers, and inflammation was one of the biggest ones. And the paleo diet came out number one with inflammation as 67%. It was the highest score that any diet got. And then it also won on the overall thing. So this was very powerful because meta-analysis is kind of the go-to thing that they want to do when they're looking at research, grouping of research studies. And this was a powerful one for us to literally win that war, because most people are, there's no research. But
this meta-analysis was looking at the diet's ability to reduce the markers of chronic disease. So obviously inflammation was a very big one. And yeah, the paleo diet came out number one. And that was particularly rewarding to us because the lab that it came out of hasn't been very favorable towards the paleo diet in the past. And you could even see it reading the discussion in the meta-analysis. They're like, yeah, these are the conclusions we drew. We don't like it.
That's awesome. I wanted to ask you guys about, the blue zones. We were talking about that as, a popular, I think it's gotten a lot of popularity recently too. There's been, I think, a new Netflix special talking about the blue zones, and there was a, the blue zones is looking at supposedly the 7 hotspots where centenarians and the highest amount of population of people living into their hundreds, and these 7 hotspots, these 7 areas. And the blue zones, essentially, if you look at all of them, one of the big commonalities is that overall they were hypocaloric and they were mostly plant-based. Right? Not a lot of meat. What do you guys say about that?
Not the case.
We've got I wrote an article, Dr. Cordain and I wrote an article. It's on our website. Just go to our website, thepaleodiet.com, search blue zones and it'll come up. But point one. If you wanted to look at longevity, you'd want to look at the oldest living people, correct?
I would think so, yeah.
Are they centenarians or are they super centenarians? They're super centenarians, people that live to 110 or more. Now, we've done that analysis. That data was available. And when you go in and look at the super centenarians, it just blows the blue zones out of the water. The list of those 7 regions, they don't compete. Where's the number one? United States. Right. So obviously it's very detailed, but you can go and look at that article. We've got the tables there and you can go do your own research where you get that database from and how you look at that.
Dr. Mark, just curious, is there a specific state or region in the United States that I can't, I'd be curious if there was.
There actually was, and Dr. Cordain even, it was a correlation, not a causation, but it was correlated to the pork consumption, which is interesting.
I was going to jokingly say the South.
I couldn't remember if it was number one, but it was definitely one of the tops was Ohio.
Wow.
Which is the top pork producing state in the country.
I can't remember the details of the states, but I think we addressed that in the article. I know Dr. Cordain did do it by state, but initially by country. But so that's the first point. The other point is a lot of the times this idea that some of those regions in the blue zones were plant based is nonsense. Like Sardinia, one of their main foods is pork.
And cheese,
It's
probably,
nonsense.
and gelato.
You know, so I mean, Dan Butner, he came here to the desert speak, but we were at a food convention in Denver and he spoke there. And he's a great speaker. And I think the research he's done on those societies, especially the family component, people that live to 100, they have a nucleus of people, and the social side of things and the exercise, all of that. There's so many good things in it, but there's a bias there. If you look at his board of directors, it's a who's who of vegans. I mean, so there is a strong bias in what they're trying to promote. And I kind of raised my eyebrows when he was talking about Sardinia, and he's like, they do eat some meat, but not very much. And then he sort of brushed on it and then moved on. And like, I did a little research on that myself, and I discovered that's not the case. That there's a very high pork consumption in Sardinia. So
we actually so we went to one of his presentations, and we had a chance to ask him about this because he talked about one of the regions and was talking about their culture and how many of them raised pork. They were pork farmers, particularly in the areas where you saw the highest levels of longevity. And then, we asked, so they eat a lot of pork? And he's like, no, we don't think so. And it kind of raises that second question of, then why are they all pork farmers?
They're exporting.
Another thing, some of the research that he has cited, like the Okinawa, I always mispronounce this, forgive me, the Okinawan, when you look at the research there, they basically said they pretty much eat a paleo diet. So we just haven't, even with the regions that they have chosen as their 7 regions, we haven't seen a ton of evidence that they're predominantly vegan. We've seen much more of an omnivore diet. And as Mark pointed out, in a lot of those regions, you actually saw high pork consumption.
Yeah. Wow. Why is pork such a superfood? You think of pork being, I've heard so many different things. Oh, it's a really dirty meat, pigs and yada, yada. And it's obviously high fat and stuff. And then, and then if you get like into some of these really nerdy, forums, and I know you guys know, pork is, I believe, high in deuterium, it's low on deuterium. And you hear about like cancer and deuterium.
You are asking exactly the question that led to this book, because this is where Dr. Cordain started. He was reanalyzing the blue zones and trying to come up with his answers for why are the blue zones the blue zones. And like I said, one of the things he discovered is, no, when he reanalyzed, and this is Dr. Cordain, he went and found records of every single person who's lived over 110 years that he could possibly find, and then did his own analysis of the regions and came up with different regions. But even like I said, when he used the regions that had been identified in the book, he saw the high pork consumption and asked that question. And this gets back to what we were talking about before of menaquinones. Menaquinones are produced by fermentation. Pigs have no issues eating rotted food. And rotted food will have a lot of menaquinones in them because they're produced through fermentation. And the pigs will store it in their fats. So the fattier tissue of the pig, like the St. Louis ribs, will be very high in menaquinones.
If people want to read that article that Dr. Cordain wrote, just again, go to the website and type in search for St. Louis, and that article will pop up. And he gets into the specific area of where the cut is. Yeah. So it's like the big thing of bacon. It's like people, we're always like, look, bacon isn't paleo. And people are like, what do you mean bacon's paleo? It's like, not really, because of the way it's processed, but you can have pork belly ribs, and that if you want to call that bacon, then okay, but it's unprocessed,
But the 2 highest foods in menaquinones are pork and chocolate. And the other interesting thing he discovered is he looked at the 20 people who had lived the longest, and any sort of records that was kept of their diet, and it was extraordinary how many of them frequently ate chocolate and ate a fair amount of chocolate. The person the man who holds the record for the longest living male worked in the chocolate industry. He was a professional chocolatier, or whatever you call it. So
that's amazing. More dark chocolate is going into my diet. I can't wait. What about fiber, guys? Just curious, was that critical, or did that come across your research? And, and again, what I'm thinking about too is, you hear the carnivore guys, oh, you don't need fiber. It's irrelevant. And then I know there's other studies that say, well, actually we see colorectal cancer and fiber. There's some type of, correlation. What do you guys think? Just in everything that you guys have gone through?
We just did a piece on the site for this, and I was, being the chief science officer, I was the one to review it. And as you say, Sean Baker's out there and he's not eaten any plants for 7 years and he's doing just fine. And, you can't just turn your nose away at that kind of stuff. So you sort of look deeper at it. So here's where I've sort of landed. I think fiber is important if you're eating plants. That sounds silly almost, right? But
Yeah.
it's nature's, it came with plants, right? It's just part of the plant. So when research shows that fiber is good, is it showing that fiber is good, or is it showing that the plant is good with all of these longevity vitamins and survival nutrients in there? And now what is interesting, you're eating a carbohydrate. What does fiber do? One of the biggest things fiber does is blunt the glycemic response. So yeah, maybe, so maybe the people that eat more animal protein, they do okay because they're not eating as much. They don't need as much fiber, but those are eating more plant-based, consume it as nature intended. So that's kind of where I've fallen on it at the moment. I think a lot of the research, it's hard to separate, if you go and just, give sort of functional fiber, like a sort of supplement type fiber. I think the research isn't quite as clear on that, but so it's a complex one for sure. Trevor might want to elaborate on that, but
Like I said, I'm more the plant guy, so I am a believer in fiber, and I would point out, proponents of the carnivore diet will always say you got to eat nose to tail, not just the muscle tissue, and particularly hunter-gatherer ancestors would have eaten the stomach and all the stomach content of the animals, and generally they're eating herbivores, so they would have gotten some fiber. But I do agree with Mark. If you are eating a more processed, high carbohydrate diet, you absolutely need that fiber. And if you're switching your diet and you're getting all those carbohydrates out of your diet, your needs are probably going to shift a little bit. And sometimes we don't consider that. A lot of the research that's done is done on people who are eating a Western diet and look what's healthiest with a Western diet. And when you're not eating a Western diet, the rules do change. And I think that's going to be some of the most interesting research that's going to come out in the next 20, 30 years.
yeah, I think that's a massive statement that Trevor just made. Is so much research has done on, relatively recently when we weren't eating a Paleolithic diet. So many things could change when you're eating, Paleolithic diet, ancestral diet, however, what version of that, on the spectrum you want to eat. I mean, one of the things we refer back to an awful lot when we're talking about macronutrients is the paper, very, seminal paper from Dr. Cordain in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, looking at those 229 hunter-gatherer tribes that were identified and to look at their plant-animal subsistence ratio. And there was quite a variety. Now, there was definitely more towards, if animals were available, that was kind of prioritized based on what we call the optimal foraging theory. You're getting more bang for your buck in terms of calories with animals than you would with plants. So it was favored towards animals. But there were some tribes that were flipped. So that's why I've always, especially clinically, I've never given a quantity amount to the foods that I'm telling you. I'm like, animal protein, vegetables, fruits, nuts, and seeds. And people go, well, how much of each? I go, you'll figure it out. I literally have been that sort of blasé. You'll figure it out. Let your body tell you. I mean, I'm definitely a protein person. I mean, if I don't have a good amount of protein on my plate, I'm eating my fingers. Literally. So I'm that way. My wife, very different. She gets by on much. She's far better, prefers it, doesn't crave the protein to the same extent that I do. So I think, listen to your body in that regard. Just make sure you get, I mean, the number one thing people need to do, let's face it, is just get highly processed foods out of the diet. That's one.
Yeah.
All right. And then move towards a natural diet. I mean, I'd argue potatoes aren't the best, but the saponins in them and some of the anti-nutrients and the high glycemic load might not be a problem. I mean, if you're Trevor riding his bike, around the world in a week, he's going to be able to handle those
Weeks.
carbs, right?
Getting
So
old.
as everyone else.
Look, I think this is such an important point. I actually just recently wrote an article about this because I think this is why people sometimes get so confused by the research on nutrition. If I was asked to design the most unhealthy diet possible, like the diet that you could eat that, you know, doesn't cross a line if it's going to kill you tomorrow, but is just absolutely the worst diet you could possibly eat. Sorry, that's a horrible description. Basically, what I would design is the Western diet. And so this is why people get confused when you have one study that says, oh, carnivore diet's healthier for you, and then another diet says vegan diet's healthier for you, and then paleo diet's healthier for you, and then keto's healthier for you. Because when you're starting at a base of basically the worst possible diet you can eat, anything is better. I always use the sport analogy of this. If you take somebody who's been a couch potato for years who isn't doing any exercise, any training is going to make them fitter, is going to make them healthier. That's very different from what is the best training for somebody who's a national caliber athlete trying to get to the Olympic level. Then there is good and bad. So I am always supportive of anybody. If they're eating a Western diet, heavily processed diet, you want to go in the vegan direction, great. Start eating fruits and vegetables, it's better for you. You want to go in the carnivore direction, start eating grass-fed meats and healthier fishes. That's fantastic, as long as you're getting the processed food out of your diet. But the question is, what is ultimately, once you've gotten away from that really bad diet, what is healthier for you? And this is what really attracted me to working with Dr. Cordain, which was he basically said, the starting point shouldn't be the Western diet. The starting point should be figuring out what we evolved around and then building a diet that approximates that. We can't eat the foods that existed 100,000 years ago anymore. They don't exist anymore. So we're just trying to approximate that and say, use that as the starting point and then do the research to find out what is healthiest. So, the first step with everybody, I don't care if you go more in the keto direction, more in the carnivore direction, more in the plant-based direction, get the processed food out of your diet, get less processed, more natural foods into your diet, and then we can talk about how to optimize from there.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think, as I just said about, we all agree getting highly processed food out of your diet is probably the first thing you should do. All of the different diets primarily do that, right? If someone becomes a vegan, immediately the highly processed food comes out. So they do well initially. But as Trevor said, then long term, once you got that processed foods out, then what becomes optimal for you? And I think, kind of common sense tells you, vitamin B12, pretty important. So I think animal protein some animal protein is essential for humanity.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you guys, in terms of paleo and athletic performance, what do you guys think? Because I know you guys are on two different spectrums. Mark, I know you're the sprinter, and Trevor, you're the endurance guy. But what are we seeing in terms of when it comes to actual performance in the paleo diet? Has there been any research, or have you actually seen, at least clinically or with your clients or patients?
Well, Trevor, you have to tell your story because he wanted to prove Dr. Cordain. He's an elite endurance cyclist. He was on the Canadian national team, so he came to Colorado State and wanted to prove Dr. Cordain, this is absolute nonsense. I'm going to do your diet and prove you wrong. So,
well, one correction, I was never on the national team. I had won a very big race. I talked to the national team coach. That was my goal. I wanted to go to one of the big games, and his exact quote to me was, Trevor, you're stronger than anybody we're sending, but we're not going to send you, nor will we ever send you to anything. You're too old.
Wow.
Well, that's a different question. But yeah, I was basically a professional cyclist for 15 years, and retired in my mid 30s because I was just struggling more. I was getting sick more often. It was just hard to keep my training consistent, and went back to school, came down to Colorado, and, was very fascinated with nutrition and exercise science and wanted to study it. And taking Dr. Cordain's course was part of my requirements. And I was the only one in the course who had never heard of him before, which is kind of the ironic thing. And I had studied traditional sports nutrition for 10 years. So I sat there in the class just going, this guy is full of it. I was so angry by the class because I had studied nothing but carbs, carbs, carbs. You can't eat enough sugar. Just, drink the sports drinks, have your goos, all that. That's the healthiest thing you can do. And I was so angry by the course, I spent the summer after that course trying to prove him wrong. And the more I tried to prove him wrong, the more I was like, oh, well, that actually makes sense. But he's got to be wrong about this. And I go and study that and go, oh, well, the research actually kind of backs that. And slowly changed my diet without even really realizing it. And so this was the year I turned 39. I had basically gone paleo and didn't even know it.
Prior to that, you were just pretty. How would you describe your diet prior? You mentioned high carb, but
I was trying to get 700 grams of carbohydrates a day. I couldn't eat enough simple carbohydrates. My breakfast was 2 bowls of cereal. I ate candy all the time. I was guzzling the sports drinks. You know what a classic endurance athlete does and thinks is the healthy thing to do. So I had completely switched it around, stopped having pasta every night, all that sort of stuff. And that winter, I was training better than I had in years, despite the fact that I had a coaching business. I was a full-time student, all that. I was just able to train really hard. I wasn't getting sick. I went to Canadian Nationals on my 39th birthday and missed 3rd place by a wheel length.
Wow.
So the following year, I joined a team and just said, let's see what I can do. And when I was 40, briefly had myself ranked top 10 in America. And I'm 54 now, and last year I still did another professional race. I mean, I don't have the time to race and train as much as I used to. And I have a picture I showed my girlfriend at the race last fall of, well, no, I wasn't in the lead, but look back in the picture. There's a whole bunch of 29-year-old pros who are way behind me. So I'm doing okay.
Yeah, not too shabby.
Yeah, so that's all the diet. It absolutely changed my training. And we've seen that in other athletes. There are a lot of top name athletes who are paleo. It's just getting them to admit to it. They don't like to say what their dietary approaches are.
In terms and just to kind of play a little bit on sports performance, but and let's just kind of flip it in terms of longevity, because I know this book touches on we're focused on obviously the diet, if you will, side of things, but in terms of longevity, lifestyle activity is important, right? How do you create that balance between, again, endurance and, or weightlifting or shorter bursts, the high intensity? What does the research say, or what have you noticed?
Well, I would advocate that we have a need to be fit enough to go and walk for long periods, for example. But, and if you do sprint interval training, you can do that. You can improve your VO2 max. And in fact, many cases, the more deconditioned people are, I think the short intervals are more successful in improving their VO2 max. We could dive deep into heart failure patients with that kind of stuff. Even people who have had heart transplants, this type of stuff has happened now. Some of the metabolic changes, some of the hormonal changes, even things like, the growth factors have changed and brought them down to younger ages with the sprint interval training. So I think it's just sort of less oxidative stress as well. It's kind of bang for the buck. I mean, here's a quick, and this is very anecdotal, but I think any human could go do this. I was trying to look at what is the minimum sort of dose. Because I do a lot of lecturing on this with TPI, and I would say, look, imagine you all go to a stadium staircase, and I blow the whistle, and I ask all of you to go as hard as you can. We're going to go 1 minute and do as many steps as you can. And I sort of impersonate them doing it. Some of you are walking, some are running, some are jogging, some are sprinting. By the end of it, no matter if you're giving me what you've got, by the time I blow that whistle, you are all gassed, right? You're bent over double and you're just done. I'm like, okay, you're done for the day. That's it. That's all we're doing. Go home, and you're not even coming back tomorrow because you're going to be stiff from that. You're going to notice if you've not been doing much, so you're going to come back the day after, and we're going to do it again. And then again, the day after that, and we're going to do this for a period of 2 months. So every other day, we're going to do 30 of these things. And I just go, intuitively, is there anyone here that doesn't think they'll do more steps on that 30th repetition than they did on the first? And everyone's like, well, of course. I'm like, okay, so just intuitively, you've told me that you can get fitter. I'm not defining what that fitness is, just better in 3.5 minutes per week. So I'm like, one day I thought, you know what, I should actually test this. So I deconditioned myself So with all of my clients, I'm a big one. Take the treadmill to 15%, and they do a minute or mini intervals to accumulate a minute with 2:30s, 3:20s, 6:10s. But I was just doing straight minute, do a minute, and I deconditioned myself to where at 15%, 7 miles per hour was gassing me. I was maxed out. So I would rest the next day. I just did one. The day after, if I was successful, I would increase it to 7.1 miles per hour and do a minute. Take a day off, and I was doing nothing else. This is all I was doing. So I did this for, I think it was 5.5 weeks. Ended up with like 18 of these sprints. And on the 18th one, I had got up to 8.3 miles per hour at 15%, doing just 3.5 minutes per week. And I've challenged many of the people within the TPI organization, all the professionals, that, you're in a gym, go do this, try it out yourself. And everyone comes back, can't believe how successful that is. So if you can improve in 3.5 minutes per week, what would happen in where I think the more of the research shows like 8 to 12 minutes per week of maximal effort sprinting can be hugely beneficial. And that's just the cardiovascular aspect. There are many other benefits to it as well.
Yeah. Being paleo guys, we always love looking at evolutionary biology. And so I've been fascinated with, how did hunter-gatherers, they didn't train, they weren't doing sports, but what was their activity like? And what you'd see is they'd run basically a marathon every other day when they were doing the hunt. And then right at the end, when they're going in for the kill, that's when they would do their short bursts of sprinting or really high intensity. And sure enough, if you look at the dominant approach, at least in endurance sports right now, it's what's called the polarized approach, which is you really should be spending 90% of your time going really slow. And by slow, I mean slow. Like you look at Olympic runners, they hit a hill, they walk up it so they can keep their heart rate down. And then you spend about 10% of your time going really hard. And that's what you see most of the top endurance athletes doing. Unfortunately, what you didn't see hunter-gatherers doing is 30 minutes on a Stairmaster going really hard for 20 minutes each day. It's just not
Right.
the way to optimal fitness.
Yeah, I think there's a book, I can't remember the guy's name who wrote it, called Burn. And I think he had spent time with the Hazda tribe. They're like the only tribe right out there where you can
Yep.
legitimately, they're like the last of the last tribe where you can see how the hunter gatherers, I think they walk 6 miles a day every day. It's just, that's part of the routine. So yeah. Really interesting. Oh man, I could ask you guys so many more questions. Yeah, the VO2 max thing. I was just thinking about the Carol Bike study where I think they did, kind of to your point. I don't know if you've seen that one but they did. I think it was 6 weeks long, and that whole it was three exercises a week for 10 minutes, and they increased VO2 max by 12%.
Yep.
And I think type 2 diet. Yeah, so interesting stuff.
Yeah, the thing that I found, there was a study done quite a while ago now. Wisloff was the author, and he was looking at heart failure patients and comparing an interval training approach to a steady state approach. I think the increase in VO2 is 36% compared to 16%. But more importantly, in these individuals, the contractility of the heart improved dramatically, so that their ejection fraction increased, stroke volume increased, and that's something that I think is hugely overlooked. And it's that vigorous activity is where you get that kind of common weightlifting, right? You weightlift, you get stronger muscles, and it's the same with the heart. And as Trevor said, you don't need a lot of it. That's the other beauty of this. It's and sometimes I think that Marty Jabala's study up in Canada, when they were doing it every day, they actually didn't see the improvements if they were doing it every other day. So that, I always like to say inactivity is a bad thing, but rest is a good thing. There's a big difference between those two things.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, this is where you're going to see Mark and I argue a little bit, because there's been tons of studies on stroke volume. And what you see with strength training is you see hypertrophy of the heart wall, so the muscle gets thicker. With endurance work, what you see is an increase in the size of the left ventricle chamber, which is really what helps improve stroke volume. Those are the major improvements you see in stroke volume. And that comes from a lot of that just long, slow training. We max out our stroke volume around 65% of our max, which is really slow. That's like just a brisk walk. And so it's just spending lots of time at that lower intensity that's going to improve that stroke volume over time.
Yeah, I was just talking about the study with heart failure patients with Wisloff. So, I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you on that.
I want to see you guys argue more. No, I'm just kidding. So Trevor, and I know we have to kind of wrap things up. I'm looking up at the time, but you're kind of talking about like sounds like the kind of like the maffetone, right? Kind of that methodology, right? Where you're kind of keeping it a lot lower. You're keeping that steady heart rate, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
But
So no, go ahead.
no, and I was just thinking as you were talking about the whole heart thing. You know the studies better than I do. What's like that you'll hear though about marathon runners, right? Having like a lot of scarring in their heart. I think it's the scarring of the heart. How does that though compare? Or versus what you're talking about?
So this is an important issue that I am personally looking at a lot right now because I now have what's called athlete's atrial fibrillation. So my heart gets a little wonky when I train, and it's entirely due to those changes in the heart. And it's one of those, if I stop training, like in the fall when I detrain, it completely goes away. But when I'm training hard, it comes back. And Mark's got his hand up.
Just you keep going, Trevor.
Yep. And it's because of the changes that you see in the heart. So people, when you have an unhealthy individual who's not active and they get atrial fibrillation, you actually see hypertrophy in the heart. You see an increase in the size of the atrium. And you see the same thing in endurance athletes. And in endurance athletes, you get some scarring, and that eventually leads to the atrial fibrillation. So it's unfortunately for a lot of us just a consequence of years and years of hard training. Something I have to deal with, and I'm still trying to figure out, is there a solution to this? Because I can make it go away by detraining, but I still love to ride my bike.
Yeah. Mark has nothing else.
Mark has something to say here. I can tell.
Mark's like,
Just,
I rest my case.
yeah, just do about 12 minutes of sprint interval training a week. You'll be fine. And then keep the body, the joint by joint. Do your corrective exercises to stay injury free.
I hate to say it, my favorite thing in the world though is going out for that 7-hour ride. It's just too much fun.
Wow. Well, I want to wrap things up with you guys. This has been really, really good. Thanks for just helping me gain some clarity on just all the confusion out there with all the diets. I mean, some of these things, you know, it helped me out because I'm always reading these things, and one day gluten's bad, one day gluten's great. You know, one day fats are bad, and one day they're great. So really helped, I know, contextualize things for me. So I appreciate it. The book Paleo for Life drops October 20. Is it in October 2025, right?
Yes, I think it's the 19th, but
19th.
I'm doing that off of memory.
Okay. Paleo for Life, Superfoods to slow aging, boost longevity, and enhance well-being. Trevor Connor, Dr. Mark Smith, thanks for being on the show. Appreciate you.
Thanks,
Real pleasure. Thank you.